She was the most scandalous princess in Europe. The sheer scale of her debauchery will absolutely shatter your worldview. She turned her bedroom into a political salon. She forged sexual pleasure into a scepter of power. She even spent her nights reveling in incestuous affairs with her own brothers. She was as boundlessly promiscuous as she was deeply devoted. Despite having countless noblemen as lovers, she would frequently kiss the severed head of the man she loved most. She penned the very first autobiographical memoir by a woman in Europe. What flowed onto the parchment was not just her scandalous romantic past, but the deeply entrenched, intricate conspiracies hidden behind the religious wars. When she wrote down the phrase everyone now knows, "My body, my choice," into her memoirs, the old men of the Parisian parliament were horrified to realize that this harlot had constructed an alternate history entirely outside their official judicial archives. Let's dive into the French film, La Reine Margot. In the late 16th century, the brutal wars between French Catholics and Protestants were endless, reaching a point of irreconcilable conflict. The royal court was luxurious yet bleak, rotting with corruption. To quell the years of civil war and secure a teetering throne, the Catholic Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, married off her daughter, Margot, to the Protestant leader, King Henri of Navarre. Margot didn't love Henri. She was merely reduced to her mother's political pawn. On August 18, 1572, an extraordinarily grand wedding took place at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Protestant leaders from all over the country flocked to this wedding of the century, each harboring their own hidden agendas. Margot's marriage was like a gamble. The stakes were the stability of her brother Charles's reign and the future ownership of the French crown. When the cardinal solemnly asked for her vows,
"Acceptes-tu pour époux Henri de Bourbon, roi de Navarre?"
Margot, draped in a gown adorned with pearls, remained expressionless. She had always resisted this political union. At the time, she was deeply in love with the Duke of Guise, but her mother had torn them apart. A dead silence filled the air. The cardinal inquired again with his eyes, but Margot only returned a cold stare. Onlookers began to whisper. Her brothers and mother sitting behind her grew increasingly embarrassed. When the cardinal asked a third time, her brother, King Charles, finally lost his patience and physically shoved her head down to force a nod. Protestants from far and wide stood up to pay their respects. The newlyweds knew all too well. This marriage had absolutely nothing to do with love. Margot wouldn't even look her groom in the eye, so they agreed to leave each other alone on their wedding night.
Ne venez pas dans ma chambre ce soir.
Behind her, Margot's brothers whispered, guessing who had been in her bedchambers the night before, and deciding which of them would take their sister tonight. Meanwhile, Catherine planted Charlotte to seduce Henri.
Mais c'est sa nuit de noces.
Justement.
The wedding festivities were to last for 3 days, featuring banquets and masquerade balls, but an undercurrent was already surging through the streets of Paris. The hostility between Catholics and Protestants was on the verge of exploding. Amidst a sea of unfamiliar faces, Margot was trying to pick a bedmate for her wedding night. However, the men on her best friend's roster weren't her type. Margot's brothers and her lover fought out of jealousy.
Et Margot, quand elle sera malheureuse, c'est dans mon lit qu'elle viendra pleurer.
Ne te réjouis pas, imbécile. J'ai refusé de partir en Pologne.
And ultimately, her lover, Guise, emerged victorious. Margot whispered to him, "See you tonight." Elsewhere, Charlotte watched Henri from afar. She walked straight up to him and invited him to spend the night with her.
Échappez au bonheur qui vous attend et passez la nuit avec moi.
Mais quel bonheur m'attend cette nuit. Un couteau dans le ventre?
Ma chambre est au-dessus de la vôtre. Cette nuit ou jamais.
Despite Henri's wariness, it seemed no man could refuse an invitation from such a stunning beauty. Guise, who completely looked down on Henri, deliberately picked a fight with him, only to be subdued by the much shorter Henri. The crowd pulled them apart, stopping a vicious brawl. That night, driven mad by jealousy, Guise waited early in Margot's chambers. Margot comforted him. Though she had long forgotten which brother she lost her virginity to, she had decided to gift her wedding night to Guise. Suddenly, her best friend warned, "Your husband is coming." In a panic, Margot had to hide Guise in a secret closet. Henri wasn't looking for Margot's love. He needed her as an ally in a court dripping with hostility toward him.
Si je vis, je serai roi de France.
Mon frère est roi de France. Les 2 autres lui succéderont s'il n'a pas d'enfants. Et leurs enfants leur succéderont à leur tour. Vos atouts sont bien faibles.
Les vôtres aussi.
Henri, seeing right through the facade, told her, "In the eyes of your mother and brothers, you are nothing but an object of exchange. Your brothers would sell you to anyone if it meant trading for a peace treaty." Henri begged Margot to protect him in this foreign land. He felt like a blind man, unable to navigate the unseen dangers. To protect Henri Margot hushed him. Seeing her panicked eyes, Henri realized that the walls had ears. The three of them stood in an awkward stalemate. Though it was a loveless political marriage, the moment they took their vows, the isolated and helpless Henri viewed Margot as his only lifeline. Seeing another man present on what should have been his wedding night, he left in sorrow. Guys, his mood ruined, also prepared to leave. Margot explained, "I may not love him, but I won't let him be hurt." Watching Guys' retreating back, Margot's mind was in turmoil. Later that night, Margot and her friend roamed the streets of Paris wearing masks, looking for prey. Suddenly, a man's horse and money were stolen. In the chaos, he dropped a book, which Margot picked up and returned to him.
Il doit être à vous.
The man's handsome yet vulnerable demeanor triggered Margot's protective instincts, while her noble mystery captivated him. Hiding in a dark corner, the two gave themselves over to passionate abandon. What they thought was just a fleeting, lustful, one-night stand instead entangled their fates together by invisible roots. Before dawn, Margot and her friend vanished into the morning mist. The man took his only possession, the book, to a pawn shop for some silver. The owner was highly intrigued by the hunting manual and handed him 100 coins. During their chat, the man mentioned he was looking for a friend nearby, but the owner broke some news. The man he was looking for was the Protestant leader Coligny, who had been shot just minutes prior. Protestants crowded around the bleeding Coligny. Luckily, he was only shot in the arm. It was all secretly orchestrated by Catherine. Margot knew full well that her mother and brothers had murdered Henri's mother, and now, with the assassination attempt on Coligny, Henri would be next. She urged Henri to flee France immediately.
Un bateau vous attend. Vous serez demain en Angleterre.
Tu partirais avec moi?
Tu comprends pas? Elle est des leurs.
Ouais, je suis des leurs. On ne fait plus rien pour vous. Vous mériterez votre destin.
Meanwhile, cries for vengeance from the Protestants were rising in intensity. As members of Henry's entourage, many of whom had traveled to Paris specifically to attend his wedding, the Huguenots now faced constant peril. Queen Catherine escalated the conflict. On August 24, 1572, under the guise of purging heretics, Catholic nobles and citizens launched a brutal massacre. Guise and the Duke of Anjou led a mob in a surprise attack against the Huguenot nobles who attended the wedding. Flames lit up the sky above the streets, and blood flowed like rivers. Tens of thousands of Parisian Catholics carried out a bloody slaughter against the Huguenots in the city. Fueled by the dual intoxication of blood and religious fervor, they lost all reason, turning into bloodthirsty monsters. The wounded Coligny was thrown from a window to his death. That night alone, they murdered over 2,000 unarmed Protestants, triggering the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This bloody night would go down in history as the Night of St. Bartholomew. The slaughter lasted from August until October, claiming an estimated 70,000 lives. On the day of the massacre, Henri and his men were captured by Guise. Margot witnessed her mother's bloody cruelty firsthand. The Louvre had turned into a living hell. Most of the Protestant nobles gathered around Henri had been slaughtered, soaking the marble floors in deep crimson blood. A man frantically pounded on every door, desperately seeking refuge. Finally, a door opened, and the man collapsed into Margot's arms. Margot drove off the soldiers, saving his life. As she tended to his wounds, Margot realized that this man was La Mole, the handsome stranger from her wedding night. He was covered in wounds, delirious from the pain. Suddenly, Charlotte rushed in, frantic, telling Margot that King Charles had taken Henri. Margot found her mother and pleaded, "You cannot kill my husband."
Si vous vouliez le tuer, il fallait le tuer avant. Il est trop tard maintenant. Vous nous avez mariés devant Dieu.
Il refuse de renier sa religion.
Je veux pas qu'on le touche.
Anjou tried to force Henri to convert his faith, but Henri would rather die than submit. Margot convinced him that he must accept in order to survive. Ultimately, Henri had no choice but to agree. When Margot returned to her chambers, she found La Mole had completely vanished. She frantically turned over every corpse in the piles of the dead. On her wedding night, La Mole had been Margot's salvation, and on the night of the massacre, Margot saved La Mole. Through these two encounters, Margot believed La Mole's arrival was the will of God. But where could she find him now? La Mole wasn't dead. Trusting no one, he had fled the palace but collapsed from exhaustion among the corpses. When a sympathetic executioner handling the bodies found him, he still had a breath left, and the executioner took him in. Under the gaze of the crowd, Henri was forced to announce the abandonment of his old faith. Margot finally saw the true cruelty of her mother and brothers. They do not act for the sake of the nation, but rather in the name of faith. They engage in acts of slaughter and control, treating everyone as mere pawns in a game of power. Though she was a Catholic, she could not accept witnessing such extreme violence and religious fanaticism.
Pourquoi sonne-t-on les cloches? Y a plus personne à tuer.
Si. Ton ami Condé qui nous a glissé entre les pattes.
She couldn't bear this inhuman atrocity. Her brother Charles felt no shame. Instead, he took pride in it.
Tu es le roi d'un pays catholique aujourd'hui. Tu peux être fier.
Oui, tu peux être fier. Tu es le roi d'un pays où plus rien ne s'agite, hormis des pendus au gibet. Paris est un cimetière.
Queen Catherine couldn't stop Margot's frenzied accusations. This event in the film marks Margot's transformation from a naive princess to a hardened political victim. Consequently, Margot was placed under house arrest by Catherine, forbidden to leave the Louvre. From the executioner, La Mole learned that Margot was actually a French princess. Although the blood of murderers flowed in her veins, she had saved his life, and all he wanted was to see her again. The executioner told him to give up the thought. Margot and Henri were under house arrest, their every move monitored. But La Mole swore to rescue Margot, returning to his homeland to find reinforcements. Catherine's children were sickly and lacked political talent. The dynasty was facing a succession crisis. Meanwhile, as Margot's husband, even though Margot had promised to renounce her succession rights on their wedding day, Henri could theoretically still inherit the French throne through her. Catherine, who thought victory was in her grasp, was told by a sorcerer that all her sons would die and the French throne would pass to Henri. This solidified Catherine's resolve. She had to pull the problem up by the roots. Catherine ordered her sorcerer to give Charlotte a lipstick, telling the girl it contained a powerful aphrodisiac. Charlotte, who had unknowingly fallen in love with Henri, only wanted to see him as soon as possible. Queen Catherine didn't want Margot involved anymore. She wanted Margot to marry the King of Spain, who had previously expressed affection for her. Margot refused, stating she was already a married woman, to which Catherine mysteriously replied that tonight, Margot would regain her freedom. A wave of intense unease washed over Margot. She rushed to find Henri, just in time to see Charlotte applying the lipstick. Just as Henri was about to kiss her, Margot shoved him away. Charlotte began foaming at the mouth, collapsed in agony, and died shortly after. Suddenly, hurried footsteps approached. The two quickly hid in the shadows. It was Margot's brothers, coming to dispose of Henri's body, only to find Charlotte's corpse instead. They threw Charlotte's body out the window, staging it as a suicide. After they left, Henri felt terrified and helpless, hating his own incompetence. He couldn't even protect a woman who deeply loved him. Margot gently comforted him, urging him not to give up and to never easily reveal who he loved, lest they become the next victim. That night, they finally consummated their marriage. It wasn't out of love, a mutual understanding and sympathy in the darkest of times. One was a puppet controlled by her mother and brothers. The other was a figurehead surrounded by enemies, his life hanging by a thread. Unable to forget Margot, La Mole returned to France. He managed to contact Margot's friend, only to learn that Margot was just like him, thinking of him every waking moment. With the friend's help, they finally reunited.
Chaque nuit, je rêvais d'un fantôme. Chaque matin, moi j'espérais que tu étais vivant.
Without the masks to hide behind, their eyes were spun with sweetness as they poured out their longing for one another. One was a French princess, the other merely a minor noble. Their love transcended the vast gap in their status. Amidst the conspiracies and religious hatred, their love became incredibly precious. Margot urged La Mole to give up trying to rescue them. Under Catherine's multi-layered surveillance, not even a bird could escape the Louvre. But La Mole insisted he would get them out of France. Their only opportunity arrived during a hunting festival, where King Charles led the royal nobles in pursuit of prey. The hounds chased and cornered a wild boar. At the last moment, Charles lunged at the beast with his spear. The wild boars scattered in all directions, startling Charles's steed. Then, in a frenzy, they attacked Charles. In the panic, his youngest brother didn't kill the boar, but accidentally shot the horse in the leg. At that critical moment, Henri stepped forward, wrestling the boar barehanded. After a fierce struggle, he finally saved Charles. This brave act only added another tally to his brother's hatred for Henri. Under the temptation of absolute power, blood ties were no match for the primal instinct of survival.
Tu vois, je ne suis pas encore mort et tu n'es pas encore roi.
Pas encore.
Meanwhile, because he was frightened, Charles insisted on returning to Paris immediately. Consequently, Henri lost his opportunity to escape. Margot, who had escaped through a secret passage in the Louvre, ended up waiting only to see La Mole return alone. If Margot stayed outside alone, the court would deem her a traitor and hunt her down immediately, and Henri would be executed inside. Tears streamed down Margot's face. She cried like a child, her tears soft and full of hesitation. By the ruins of an old castle, Margot begged La Mole to never leave her.
Jure-moi que si je meurs, tu conserveras la tête que le bourreau aura séparée de mon corps et que tu appliqueras quelquefois tes lèvres.
Je te le jure.
To save Henri, Margot had no choice but to return to the Louvre. But Henri was unappreciative. He had already heard rumors of Margot and La Mole's affair, and he genuinely believed King Charles would protect him now. Margot reminded Henri not to forget that this was the same king who had ordered the slaughter of so many Protestants. Yet Henri felt that since Charles trusted him now, her worries were unnecessary. This agonizing uncertainty tormented Margot. She only wanted the two of them to get out of there as soon as possible. Just as Henri guessed, he became the only person the king trusted. They frequently hunted and chatted together, but Catherine was still determined to eliminate Henri. Well versed in various poisons, Catherine had her youngest son sneak a highly toxic hunting manual into Henri's room to poison him. The young prince placed the book on Henri's desk when no one was around. Hearing footsteps, he quickly ducked into the shadows, but upon hearing Henri's voice outside the window, the young prince realized he had made a fatal mistake. He watched as King Charles eagerly flipped through the book, licking his fingers to turn the pages. He knew his brother was ingesting their mother's poison, but he didn't dare make a sound. He could only watch in silence as his brother crept closer to death. Meanwhile, upon learning of Margot's affair with La Mole, her brothers flew into a rage. They took turns shoving and insulting her. Charles's poison took effect, and he suddenly collapsed. He writhed in agony, his throat and stomach burning like fire. Suddenly finding the strength to stand, he returned to his room, only to find his hound foaming at the mouth. In the dog's mouth were chewed up scraps of the hunting manual. He immediately sought out the sorcerer and learned it was a slow-acting poison mixed with arsenic, specially concocted by him. The symptoms the sorcerer described matched exactly what he was feeling. Charles knew the sorcerer had poisoned the lipstick before and had now soaked the book in venom. Under fierce interrogation, Charles finally learned the cruel irony. It was all his mother's doing. But how could the King of France denounce his own mother as a murderer? For the sake of the family's honor, he had to take the secret to his grave. However, he knew that once he died, Catherine would never let Henri live. During a hunt, he gave Henri the chance to escape. Henri begged him to grant Margot her freedom as well, but ultimately, Charles refused. The news of Charles's poisoning spread across France. To cover up her conspiracy, Catherine needed a scapegoat. The original owner of the hunting manual was La Mole. It was the very book he had pawned, bearing his signature, and this book was about to become his grave. Upon returning to his homeland, Henri was welcomed by his people, but La Mole was going mad with worry over Margot's safety.
Je n'abandonnerai pas Margot.
Tu ne peux pas y aller toi-même. Envoie quelqu'un.
Va la chercher, toi. Dis à Margot que la Navarre sera pour elle, jusqu'à son dernier souffle, une terre d'asile.
With Henri's blessing, he snuck back into Paris to rescue Margot. However, he and his companion walked right into Guise's trap. When Margot rushed over to beg Guise to spare La Mole, Guise, having long since severed ties with her, took them away anyway. The king was terminally ill, knowing his days were numbered. Controlled by his mother Catherine since childhood, he was weak-willed, but he wasn't a foolish ruler. He had always tried to break free from her grip, but in the end, he was reduced to a casualty of the power struggle. Margot fell to her knees, begging her brother to release La Mole. Charles quietly told her, "We need him as a scapegoat. Go to Henri immediately, or sooner or later, you will die at Catherine's hands." On his deathbed, Charles revealed the secret of Catherine's poison. He said, "For the honor of the royal family, you must endure the pain of losing your lover, just as I must die in silence." Witnessing Charles dying from the poison, Margot felt profound grief for his short. Charles had trusted and relied on Margot. Because Henri had saved his life, he tried to protect Margot. Yet he couldn't escape his own mother's deadly reach. To consolidate power, Catherine had orchestrated the plot to murder Henri, only to mistakenly kill her own son Charles. Faced with her brother's death, she was shocked by her mother's ruthlessness and felt absolute despair over her family's mutual slaughter. Charles passed away, and eventually, Catherine's other son, Anjou, ascended the throne. La Mole was led to the guillotine. Before his execution, he had promised Margot, "If your lover dies, he will be by your side forever." This vow, brimming with a sense of destiny, was both a sacrifice to love and a helpless surrender to death. He clung to his friend in terror, but the executioner tore them apart. His friend was entirely innocent, yet chose to stay by La Mole's side. Together, they were beheaded. In the freezing light of dawn, Margot, having bribed the executioner, walked out of the execution grounds, cradling La Mole's severed head. She took off her jewelry and gave it to her friend, instructing the executioner to bury her personal belongings alongside La Mole's body. She chose the most resolute way possible to sever ties with her family. Margot fled Paris, carrying her lover's head, riding toward Navarre, where Henri awaited. Her white dress, stained with blood, appeared at once resplendent and macabre, like a shackles from which Margot could not break free. It also marked the moment she confronted torture and death head-on, offering a silent, resolute act of defiance against her mother's tyranny, and thereby finally breaking free from her destiny as a mere political pawn. At this moment, Margot was both a survivor of the Game of Thrones and a prisoner of love. As the carriage jolted along, a single tear quietly slipped down her cheek. Adapted from Alexandre Dumas's novel of the same name, this film was released in 1994. 39-year-old French actress Isabelle Adjani played the 20-year-old Princess Margot, radiating an irresistible, captivating aura. As her lover La Mole described in the film, "You smell as sweet as jasmine." Adjani's pure, almost first love-like beauty became a mesmerizing temptation. Her phenomenal performance in this film rightfully earned her the Best Actress award at the Cannes Film Festival that year. The movie pulls no punches in exposing the dark hearts of the royal nobility. Amidst the bloody romance of shifting power, history always writes a more ironic script than any author ever could. In 1589, Queen Mother Catherine passed away. That same year, the new king was assassinated, leaving Margot as the sole surviving member of the French royal family. French law dictated that the crown be passed to a male, not a female, so the throne could only be inherited through Margot's male ties. Margot's husband, Henri of Navarre, was crowned King Henri IV of France. In the lethal hunting game for power, Catherine went from ruling the world to having nothing at all. The ultimate irony of her life. The staggering impact of the film's final scene stems not only from the acting and cinematography, but also from the profound resonance where history, literature, and cinema overlap, while La Mole's severed head serves as a dark metaphor for the collective trauma of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. As Margot's carriage rides off into the distance, she stands as the protagonist of her own personal tragedy and a microcosm of all the crushed idealism of the religious war era. The freezing head in her hands is the final gift from her beloved, as if La Mole's whispers are still echoing in her ears.